Welcome back. You've made it to the final component of reading, comprehension. Open up your binder to page 113, take the pretest, and then resume the video. This is the end goal. This is when we know everything else is working, when comprehension comes together. So just like in all the other components, we're going to talk about what comprehension is, why it's important, how do we teach it, how do we assess it, how do we remediate it, and what is your action plan. You can take notes in your graphic organizer as we go. Just like all of the other components of literacy, comprehension has a continuum from simple to complex skills. And the thing is we often don't think about how to explicitly directly teach those higher level comprehension skills. So in this module, we're going to teach what the continuum is and how to explicitly teach some of those higher level skills that we really want our intermediate and secondary students to achieve. When I first started teaching back in 2003, I remember really explicitly getting scholastic books that had comprehension skill of the week. So it would be main idea or supporting detail, or we would do prediction for a week. We would do isolated inference skills. And what we really have learned since then is that we want to get away. That's not the research-based method. We want to get away from teaching comprehension skills in isolation. Instead, we want to build real knowledge. We want students to know about the world. We want them to know about science ideas and history. And we don't necessarily want to teach comprehension as our lesson. Instead, we want students to think about comprehension skills as just tools or things that really proficient readers naturally do that can help them. We're going to continually talk about how we can think of this as tools instead of lessons. So instead of teaching main idea and supporting detail, I would teach about the Underground Railroad. And while reading a passage about the Underground Railroad, I might pull out, well, what is the main idea of this lesson? And how do we know that? And what predictions can you make based on what's happening in the text? So we're actually using all of those comprehension skills all the time. We're not teaching them in isolation. I recently had the opportunity to hear Natalie Wexler, the author of The Knowledge Gap, speak at a literacy conference. And what she writes in this book is fascinating. She says that what is broken in our education system is that we got away from teaching real content, and that we focus so much on the skills of reading and writing or the micro skills of literacy and language that we forgot or we've pulled away from teaching real things, real history, real science, how the world works. And the truth is, their knowledge is sticky. And if you know stuff, you actually become a better reader. And so there is a study that was done that Natalie Wexler highlights in this book. It is called the baseball study. And they took a group of fourth grade students and they kind of separated them into quadrants. So they had really good readers, above grade level readers, and they had below grade level readers, struggling readers. And they also had kids that knew a lot about baseball and had played baseball, had watched baseball, knew the game. And they also had students that knew little to nothing about baseball. And then they gave them a grade level text about baseball. And it was a text full of rich knowledge about baseball, about the game itself, about the vocabulary of baseball. And then in the end, they had several comprehension questions. And if you can predict between those students, so we had high readers that knew a lot about baseball, we had high readers that knew little about baseball, we had low or struggling readers that knew a lot about baseball, and we had struggling readers that knew little to nothing about baseball. Can you predict which one of those groups of students performed the highest on the comprehension assessment? obviously the kids that were great readers and knew a lot about baseball, right? But here's what's surprising. Guess which group of kids did the second best? It was actually the poor readers that had a lot of knowledge about baseball. And what this study showed us is that background knowledge is hugely important in reading comprehension. That if students know a lot about what they're reading, they can kind of muddle through some of the decoding and some of the sentence structure things and still gain fairly high comprehension. But if you have high readers that are decoding well, but do not comprehend anything they're reading, they have no background knowledge, they don't know the vocabulary of the article, they can't visualize it, reading comprehension breaks down. And the end result of that is that it is so important for us as teachers to build background knowledge, to teach our students real content so they have background knowledge when they go out into the world and they're reading. So I did my own little research experiment with this. And every year I would give a Dibbles passage to our third grade students as a progress monitoring passage. And every year our growth was looking good, growing. And then they'd hit this one passage about a nature preserve. And every year the scores would go down with all of the students. And for a while we were disheartened and the teachers were like, I don't know what's happening. They were making good growth and now they're not. And then we finally realized oh, it's just that nature preserve passage. The students always dip there. So let's not even worry about our scores. And then I was doing this as a presentation in a live course a couple summers ago. And I said, wouldn't it be fascinating to do an experiment and to give students some background knowledge about nature preserves before they read that passage? And one of the participants said, why don't you do that? And so I put a sticky note in my binder. And when we got to that passage, I went ahead and let my third grade reading intervention students take it as usual, normally. And as you can see in the graph below, shown, this is the blue lines. And so I had 6 students and the blue was their normal passage. Then later that day, I pulled those 6 students aside and I gave a 9-minute mini lesson about nature preserves. I helped them decode the word nature and actually showed them that URE is a suffix that is added to a lot of words like picture and lecture and adventure. And so you can, once you know that suffix and know the pronunciation is a little tricky, you can decode words with that. And then we talked about preserve, what that word was and how we could decode that word, and that it actually has the prefix pre, meaning before. And if you can tell, the spelling has a E at the end, but that's not a magic E. That's a placeholder E because no English word ends in V. And so then we talked about not only how to decode those words, but actually what they meant. And that preserve means that you set it aside before it's ruined. So you can preserve food before it's spoiled, or a nature preserve sets aside land before it is developed by humans, right? So I gave this 9-minute lesson. We talked about nature preserves in our area and that they had indeed been to nature preserves. We just didn't call it that. And then we talked about what they would take when they went to a nature preserve and what they might experience. And then the next day, I had them read that same passage. Now, keep in mind, this was their second read, but it was a day apart, and these were readers that typically struggled with accuracy and fluency, right? So they're not like, the second read probably wouldn't make or break that read. And if you look at the graph, they all increased significantly. And so thinking about that idea when you're teaching content, that maybe you show a video of a volcano exploding. Maybe you show pictures of an archipelago. Whatever you happen to be teaching, if you build some background knowledge before they go and read the passage independently, their reading comprehension will surprise you. Knowledge is sticky, it's Velcro. And so if you know something about a content area, then when you hear it or when you read it, you have something to kind of Velcro on new knowledge. You're like, oh, I know a little bit about nature preserves. This article, I can access my background knowledge. So this is such an important concept. Okay, let's talk about the shift. So we used to teach comprehension as isolated skills, and now we know that we really want to teach real content instead. A few years ago, the Common Core State Standards did a shift for all of their standardized tests, and we created new standards that elevated and increased the rigor or the advancement on that comprehension continuum. Here are some of the shifts that they did. They said students need regular practice with complex text and academic language. They need to be reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. And they need to be building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. And so they were going to build these standards, and then standardized tests followed suit. So notice that the first one is really fascinating because it says that they need exposure or practice with complex text. But what happens when we have students that can't decode complex text? In years prior, we would send those kids down the hall. They might be in a different reading group, they might be in an intervention group, and they would have exposure to completely different texts that were on their reading level. The problem is that those students were never exposed to these complex knowledge ideas. They were never exposed to the higher level comprehension skills that we want them to do. They never were exposed to that rich vocabulary. And so the gap just kept getting wider. And so what we want to do now is we want to expose students to rich, complex text, even if they can't decode them independently. So we need to scaffold and support and still be working on getting them to decode accurately, right? That's a different lesson, but we don't want to pull them out and give them texts that are way below reading level and never expose them to grade level content. So for that same intervention group that I was speaking about earlier, we did novel studies in intermediate grades, and we used to give those novel studies, we would teach abridged versions or excerpts of that or not at all. And what we've recently done to switch that is that we would still have every student be participating in the novel study. Now, they might be in an intervention group that is going in depth with just a page or two of that novel and really looking at the patterns that they're looking at and the sentence structure and the language comprehension. And then a great majority of that novel might be on audiobook or read out loud to them. But we were still exposing them to great character development, to complex text structures, to plot, and to rich vocabulary. So thinking about what your exposure to grade level content is for your students, but also how you're supporting and scaffolding those students that may not be capable of doing it independently is a really important question. The second big shift is reading, writing, speaking that is grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. So we're not asking just fact-finding questions like what color was her dress or what year did the story take place, but instead we're wanting to give those higher level comprehension tasks and have students not only give their answer, but cite text evidence to support their thinking and especially their predictions or inferencing. We want to build knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. This is basically teaching them the real stuff. We want to make sure that their background knowledge is really phenomenal. And I have a perfect example of this, that my youngest son went to a core knowledge school. And every year he was just kind of a sponge. He loved history anyway. But we went to Washington, D.C., and this amazing history-rich city, I knew minuscule history, just basically the history that of the grades that I taught. I really didn't get content-rich knowledge growing up. And while we were walking through all of these incredible museums and statues, my son was like, oh, let me tell you about this story of this battle or this president. And my mom was just like, this is phenomenal. Like, how does he know all of this? He knows by far more about the history of our country than she and I did. And it goes to show that young students can learn a lot. If you're going to read a passage and talk about main idea and supporting detail, you might as well be teaching them really cool, real content. Okay. This is the key factors in comprehension going well. So I said comprehension is kind of the end goal, right? It's the result of a student being able to decode accurately. It's the result of a student fluently reading so that they're not struggling word by word, that they can think about what they're reading instead of working on the accuracy and the decoding. It is that the student has vocabulary to understand what they're reading, the language backing. And I want you to look at, this is what it takes for that check mark, that like, aha, that end result to work. Students need strong language comprehension skills. They need rich vocabulary. They need metacognition strategies, so they're thinking about what they're reading, right? They're understanding or thinking about if they get it or not, and they know how to fix it if they're not comprehending. They have background knowledge so that they're comprehending what they're reading because they already know a little bit about it, and they're reading accurately and fluently at the word and sound level. So looking at all of these things that have to be in place in order for it to work, what do you notice? This is exactly the simple view of reading, right? Think back all the way to the first module that we had about the simple view of reading. And in order for reading comprehension to work, that was the product or the end result. We had to have students accurately and fluently decoding, and we had to have them understand the words that they were reading. They had to understand the vocabulary. They had to understand what they were reading and have some background knowledge about it. And so this is full circle. These are not what we teach, but the end result if everything is working. Giving students language structures or text structures is really important. That teaching them that texts are usually either fiction or story based, or nonfiction and factual based, and that stories follow a very predictable structure. They have characters and a setting and a beginning or rising action and a climax and resolution or falling action, and all of those are very predictable at the most primary nursery fairy tales and at the most complex 8-inch novels that we read, right? And the same is true with nonfiction. We have very predictable text structures. Sometimes it's compare and contrast. Sometimes it's descriptive. Sometimes it's cause and effect. But if we teach students these text structures, it will actually aid them in their reading comprehension, and it will aid them in their writing. It becomes very predictable. They know they're going to read a story and that they should be cueing into setting and character development. They know they're reading a text that they're gleaning information from, and they are anchoring that text structure. So teaching text structure, we often teach text structure in writing, but we really want to do it in both reading and writing. So developing comprehension, this is, okay, so we have a student who it isn't really working for, right? How do we develop it without just teaching those isolated comprehension skills? Here are some ways that you can develop comprehension. Start with listening comprehension. So if a student is not accurately decoding, or if they're not comprehending, I guess the first question is, are they accurately decoding? If they are accurately decoding, then we have to figure out what's breaking down with their comprehension, their language. And one of the ways that we can do this is by teaching them skills of listening comprehension. And so I'm going to show you in a picture book in just a second how you can build that. Giving them strategies for visualization and building mental imagery. Some students do this very naturally. They just build the movie in their head as they hear stories as children. Other people do not build mental images. And so knowing that it's a smaller percentage of students, but still knowing who in your room, when they're reading, they're not building mental images. When you're reading out loud, they're not building them. And then helping them develop that. There's a book called Visualizing and Verbalizing by Linda Mood Bell, and she gives structure words that are in your packet, and it's helping students tune in that authors give us words that will help us visualize. They give us colors and size and movement and shape. And so if we tune into that, then that will help us visualize. If we tune in to the rough grizzly bear's brown scratchy fur, then we can actually close our eyes and visualize the color and the texture and the size of that bear. Wordless picture books are a really powerful way to build comprehension, and I have done wordless picture books with even older students. There are some incredible wordless picture books that are really complex and creative storylines, but it takes away the students' decoding the problem of decoding, right? It takes away their mental desk space in decoding and allows them to just focus on that plot and those characters. And then predictable story structure. So this is what I was saying about story structure in general. Having lots of exposure to plot and naming that for them and pointing it out and teaching them that will help them know how to read and comprehend as we go. So one of my very favorite picture books, I actually bought this as a 5th grade teacher when I was teaching Russian history. And so I found this picture book. It's called The Magic Nesting Doll, and it has incredible illustrations, but also a lot of cultural references to Russian history. So I would argue that it is never too late to use picture books in your teaching. If I was a high school English teacher, I would read picture books. The vocabulary is often really rich. It is a great way to do mini lessons and really teach some of these higher level concepts without reading the entire novel to get through the whole plot. So pause the video, and I have a lesson in Moodle about the magic nesting doll and building visualization using text structures that are provided. So pause the video, watch the magic nesting doll lesson, and then join us back here. Like I said, wordless picture books can be really powerful in building comprehension. So thinking about teaching some of the skills that we want readers to naturally do. We want them to naturally be predicting. We want them to be inferring what's going to happen next. We want them to be looking at all of the clues that the author is giving it and doing their own thinking about it. And so I often teach some of those skills using wordless picture books. So this one, Chalk, is about a group of children that go to a park and they find a bag of sidewalk chalk. And anything that they draw ends up coming to life. And it is a really great way to teach about inferencing and stepping up their inferencing skills in a really fun, lighthearted, no risk way. So this is my nephew, and I thought it would be a really great birthday gift to send him the book Chalk, and I sent him some dinosaur sidewalk chalk. And this is what the reaction was when he drew something that did not actually come to life. And my sister-in-law texted and was like, yeah, thanks a lot. This was a great birthday gift. Let's talk about the Super 7. These are 7 comprehension skills that good readers, people that are actively reading well, naturally do. And so if we have students that are struggling with reading, we want to point out to them what good readers do, right? And we're not teaching these in isolation, but we are teaching them, modeling for them how to do this as they read so that they can begin to do this naturally. So here are the Super 7. Monitor your own comprehension. So this is if you read to the end of the page and you turn the page and you're like, oh, wait, I was actually just thinking about the football game after school the whole time, and I wasn't thinking about that page at all. Students have to be able to monitor that and be like, whoa, I need to go back and and do something differently, right? To go back and reread, to go back and pay attention, to ask myself questions, to maybe read out loud. But I can't just keep reading and never be aware that I'm not really actually comprehending what I read. The next one is cooperative learning. So if we want students to be comprehending, the more they can be discussing and actively participating in lessons with other people, the better. We want to use graphic organizers and semantic organizers, idea webs. We want to have question answering, so answering questions about the text. We also want to have question generation. So we often give students questions to answer after reading a text, but how often do you give students a text and then have them create or generate questions? We want to teach them story structures and summarizations. So we're doing all of these things. We're showing them that this is what good readers do while we're teaching real content. The next is make it tangible. So anytime that comprehension is needing to be bolstered in any way, we want kids to be comprehending, right? And maybe they can comprehend at very simple early stages of the continuum, but then when we get higher into that continuum and skills are more challenging, we're asking them to find evidence and support their claims and infer based on background knowledge. All of that becomes complicated, and we're like, well, how do you actually explicitly teach those higher level skills? And this book called Comprehension Connections does a really fabulous job of giving tangible lessons to intangible concepts. So when I just say to students, like, I want you to make an inference, or I want you to infer what's going to happen, that's hard to even explain, right? It's hard to even define what that means. And so this book does a really great job of giving them specific examples. So that reading is not just moving your eyes across the page, but real reading is moving your eyes across the page while also thinking about what you're reading. So the opening scene of the book is the little girl who is at a family holiday dinner, and her whole family is gathered around the dinner table, and everyone's bowing their heads to pray. And as soon as they say amen, she blurts out, "I want the leg." And everyone starts laughing at her. And the reason they laugh at her is because they're eating salmon. But the reason that she said that is because normally at that dinner, at that meal, they would have had roasted chicken or turkey. And so she said that was her pivotal moment, like the moment in her life when she stopped being brave enough to ask questions. And if you think about when you're around little kids, when you're around toddlers, or when you're around really small children, they ask a bazillion questions, so many questions that you kind of want to pull your hair out, right? But then if we think about our intermediate and our secondary students, they stop asking questions. Many of them stop asking questions. And research has shown that question generation, the idea of asking questions while we're reading, is the number one comprehension skill that good readers do. They're thinking about what they're reading. They're naturally asking questions as they're reading. And so we want students to get in the habit, reform their ideas around questions. So her first lesson in the book is about getting students to ask questions again. And she said, find something in your house or at school that is really interesting and unique and something that the students wouldn't have common day knowledge about. And so I went and walked around my house and I found this really interesting box sitting on my bedroom shelf. And I was like, well, I have no idea what this box is. I've never actually noticed it or seen it. But to give a little background knowledge, I had recently got remarried and my husband and I joined households. So I was like, okay, well, this is obviously something weird that he brought to our home. And so I took it into school the next day, and I was working with 4th through fifth grade students that were struggling with comprehension. And I did this activity with them. And I said, I found this thing in my house. I have no idea what it is. What are your questions about it? And they were incredible. Like, if you do this with a room full of adults, they ask some questions like, well, is it valuable, or where'd you find it, or why is it dusty, or what is it, how old is it? But students are hysterical, and they can get so creative if you give them permission to just be kids and be silly and to let that part of their brain activate. And so in the end, this is an old clock that is broken. It doesn't work any longer. But all of their questions of, is it magical? Is it valuable? Could you sell it for $1 million? All of those questions were really great. And what the point of the lesson is while you're reading, be that engaged. Be thinking about what is happening in the story, and ask the questions like, do you think that the grizzly bear is going to come back and eat all the people in the cabin? And have them actually get to where, while you're reading, it is a safe space for them to ask questions, because that is actually the number one comprehension strategy. So there are 4 kinds of questions. The first question is just the right there question. What year did the Civil War end? And it's right in the text, the Civil War ended in 1865. The next questions are author and you questions. And these are questions that the text spurs that idea, but you can just answer using your own background knowledge. It can usually be like experience-based questions or something that students would just naturally already know. Then there are think and search questions, and these are the best bang for your buck. These questions they're in the text, but they're not right there. Students have to connect some pieces. They have to maybe make an inference of like, I know this and the text said that, so my inference would be. They're definitely higher level questions, and when we get on that continuum, that's where we want our intermediate and our secondary students to be. And then there are on my own questions that are just, I already can answer that just from my own background knowledge. Maybe it is a question about football and I play football, so I just already know that. So when you are formulating questions for your assignments, you're really trying to get those like think and search and cite questions. So in your resource vault, you will find the comprehension questions, higher level comprehension questions that go by different skills. They can be like main idea and supporting detail questions and inference questions. So that is a really useful tool when you're trying to get some of those think and search and cite questions and not just those other more simplistic. We also have a prediction stepped up lesson and an inference stepped up lesson that we will have in the resource vault for you to follow, and also in the videos that you can watch me modeling both of those. So how do you get up onto that continuum, and how do you explicitly teach those higher level thinking skills? If you take out your binder and flip to your Improving Adolescent Literacy section, this is actually recommendation number 2 for improving adolescent literacy. Provide direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. So you're going to pause the video, you can read that article and annotate with the following symbols, and then rejoin us. We're going to continue talking about how to effectively teach these comprehension skills and strategies, and this will be part of your reflection guide today. Jumping back into improving adolescent literacy, recommendation number 3 says, provide opportunities for extended discussion of text meaning and interpretation. And so we often have teacher-led discussions, right? We often are explaining the theme and talking about character development and maybe the plot of a story. But the real power comes from when the majority of the talking is done by students. So pause the video, read recommendation number 3, annotate it, and again, this will be part of your comprehension journal response. Let's talk about assessing comprehension. If you think back when we were talking about Scarborough's reading rope, and the bottom half, the blue micro skills, are the constrained skills. They have a ceiling, right? We know that there are 6 syllable types and 44 phonemes. And so we know we can monitor and assess that, and we know when a student knows those skills, they've got it. Comprehension is an unconstrained skill. It's on the top half of Scarborough's reading rope, and they're much more difficult to assess, and they're much more difficult to gauge, well, what exactly does it take to be a grade level in 8th grade for comprehension? It's harder. Here are the skills needed in order for comprehension to work. These are the things that, if comprehension's the end game, it's the result, these are all the things that have to be in play in order for that result to work. Students need to accurately and fluently word decode. So thinking about that at a secondary level, that means they need to decode multisyllabic words, right? They need a broad base of vocabulary knowledge. We want to make sure that they have those core vocabulary words. We want them to make sure that they know what predict and inference and hemisphere and all of those words that are part of our vocabulary that really are embedded in academic work. We have to teach them. We have to know that they know those words. They have to have access to robust background knowledge. We know knowledge is sticky, so the more they know, the better their comprehension will be. They need to be aware of sentence, paragraph, and text structure. And so in primary, that sentence is just a predicate, a subject, and a predicate. But in higher level secondary text, we need to make sure that they understand compound, complex sentences. We need that text structure to be at a higher level, and we need to make sure that we've taught that to them. Same with text structure, as far as text structure of nonfiction text versus fiction text. We need to teach them to monitor their own comprehension, that if they don't comprehend something, they have strategies and know what to do about it. And then we want to give them application to teach them how to apply those strategies if things are breaking down. What strategies do they have if they don't know how to decode a word? What strategies do they have if they read a sentence and it sounds incredibly not fluent and it sounds awkward? How do they go back and tune into punctuation and be able to read it more fluently? How do they monitor when they know they haven't comprehended something? What can they do to jump back into that text to fix their comprehension? Assessing comprehension can feel overwhelming and challenging. We like to say, if there's any red flags, so if a student's work is a red flag, if a student's tests are a red flag, if a student's standardized test are low, all of those are an indicator or a red flag that something might be wrong with comprehension. There is in your binder this comprehension questionnaire that you can ask some questions to get yourself started drilling down on what's breaking down in a student. And then we also have the assessment flowchart. We're going to go into a lot of detail about this flowchart in our assessment module, in our data module, but notice that in this assessment flowchart, we either go to decoding is an issue, or we go to comprehension is an issue. And once we've identified that comprehension is an issue, then we can go down those steps and drill down a little bit deeper. So we'll go into much more detail about that when we get to our data analysis. So let's step back and think about the quadrant model for a minute. We are hoping that we have all students that are accurate decoders and comprehenders, and that would be the typical reader, right, in the upper right-hand corner of the quadrant. We also talked about in our word level that when students comprehend and they have great vocabulary and great background knowledge, but they simply can't lift the words off the page, they can't decode and spell the words, that's called dyslexia, or that student has dyslexic tendencies. In the opposite, we have the comprehension quadrant. So it's just the bottom right-hand corner. And this is when students have high decoding and low comprehension. And the problem is that we often miss these kids until later grades. So in kindergarten, first, second grade, their scores are all green on their assessments, they're decoding, the texts are simplistic, there's lots of pictures that aid them in comprehension. And so we don't really get these red flags until third, fourth, fifth grade. And then those, as a fourth, fourth or fifth grade teacher, then you suddenly are like, what is happening with this kid, right? Their responses are all over the place. Or when I ask them a question, their response doesn't make any sense. They are deer in the headlight on standardized tests. They're just wildly guessing oftentimes. So we want to really try as hard as we can to identify those kids that have the comprehension issue and give them some of the remediation support as quickly as we can. And then we have the double deficit in the left, where they're struggling with decoding and they're struggling with comprehension. And again, where your student is in this quadrant, we want to make sure that every day they are exposed to grade level content, that they are hearing the character development and the story structure and the plot, and they're hearing the higher level vocabulary and they're building background knowledge. Otherwise, that gap is just going to continue to grow. So let's talk about how we remediate comprehension. This is the trickiest of all. I had a group of fourth grade students one year that we had worked really hard for several years on their decoding, and they were accurate, fluent readers, and yet they were floundering keeping up with their classwork and just absolutely could not read independently with any kind of grade level comprehension. And so I began a semester-long comprehension intervention, and it was one of the most challenging, interesting, eye-opening things that I'd ever done. I documented that process in a series of blogs, so you can go back into Moodle and look at those blogs. But the more research I did on the simple view of reading and the comprehension deficit was that there are really four main areas for comprehension in general. And the first one is background knowledge. The second one is syntax of how a language works together in sentence structures. The next one is vocabulary and visualization. So we've touched on all four of those throughout these modules already. You can go back in and really look at all of the nuances of what is interplayed with those and how it ended up. To just give you the end result, in the end, that group of students grew a little bit, but not anywhere near as much as I had hoped. And what I realized is building language comprehension is actually much more complicated than building word level skills. And so one semester of intense language intervention with those four things, it helped, but it wasn't like an instant cure. So there is no quick fix. We have to do all of the things to support those readers and to help them learn what good readers do and how comprehension naturally occurs. So here are some things that you can do. You can preview and pre-teach. You can do a teaching strategy called experience before label. So this is you show them the picture or the video of a volcano exploding before you name the parts of the volcano and list the vocabulary words of this is magma and this is what happened in that process, right? So you get them sucked in with some kind of emotional response where then they can visualize it and they have some background knowledge before they're going to read about it. You can broaden their exposure to nonfiction text, so tons of read alouds, videos, audio visuals, building that background knowledge. If they can't read a text about something complicated, let them listen to the audio about it or you read it out loud. Again, even if I was a history teacher, I would do a lot of audio. I would do a lot of read alouds. I would make sure that they had a lot of exposure to accurate, fluent reading that is building background knowledge. Give access to the same content with lower readability. So this is for independent work, right? I want to make sure that I'm still exposing them to grade level content, but then if we're going to read an article, I might give them or the same content, but perhaps with a lower Lexile level. And if you want to learn more about Lexile levels, you can jump in and I have an entire video and explanation on how Lexile levels work and how you can use those to help your readers. My one caveat with that is making sure that the passages that they're reading at a lower readability still have the same content and they're still rich with vocabulary. So maybe doing some pre-teaching for that vocabulary, but then giving them where the majority of the text is written at a lower readability is great. Scaffold and support for rigorous text. So maybe not reading the entire chapter independently, but they're reading one page and we're really going in depth together on that one page, and then they listen to the rest of the chapter on audio. How do you make it stick? These are, again, multisensory ideas that we keep going back to. We want to activate as many parts of the brain as we can. So involve 2 or more modalities. Limit silent reading and independent seat work for students that are struggling. So our practice of drop everything and read, or that sustained silent reading. The problem is those students that are struggling are most likely just wasting that 30 minutes. So how could you instead work with them in small group, or let them have access to audio text where they're reading along somehow, where they're not just sitting and staring at a page. Active verbal modeling. So as I'm reading out loud, as I'm reading the novel, I am modeling for them my think alouds. I'm modeling for them when I make an inference. I'm modeling for them how I'm figuring out words based in context. I'm doing a ton of stopping to point out what good readers do and modeling for them. I use active vocal student practice. So I'm engaging them. They're calling back to me. They're answering questions. They are actively participating in as much of the lesson as possible. Using graphic organizers and semantic organizers are really helpful. Visual representations of text, something that they read, you show a picture of, especially things like if you're talking about the anatomy of an eyeball, obviously that visual is going to be hugely helpful, right? And then drawing and picturing. So we talked about, for students that have dyslexia, how do we build a dyslexic friendly classroom? How do we make sure that every student in our classroom is accessing the knowledge that I'm teaching? Now we're going to do that exact same thing with how do I make sure that I have a comprehension deficit classroom? So for dyslexia, I needed to offer systematic instruction in phonics and in phonological awareness, and making sure that I'm giving them direct, explicit instruction in how our language works, cracking the code of our language. This time we want to offer intense instruction in language understanding, focusing on building vocabulary and background knowledge. Some accommodations that can help for these kids that naturally struggle with this: showing pictures and videos. This is basically exactly what our last slide was, right? So read through that, making sure that we're just modeling, and really being aware of who is in our classroom that we're going to need to tune into and offer and give some support. Let's talk about syntax. We keep talking about this. We've brushed upon it in fluency, and now here it is again in comprehension. Syntax is a really powerful comprehension tool. And if we know how our sentences work, we can use that to our advantage to help kids comprehend. So if I had just taught a lesson about Civil War, I can use syntax callbacks to engage and to bolster comprehension. It might be something like this. Robert E. Lee was the general of the Confederate Army. Who was the general of the Confederate Army? Robert E. Lee. What did Robert E. Lee do? He was the general of the Confederate Army. And those callbacks, even just very naturally, so I wouldn't say like, now we're going to do comprehension callbacks, but if I just am reading along and then I have students call back, it builds engagement and it also solidifies that. And you will notice that these are just, I'm giving the subject and the predicate of the sentence, right? So if I said, the Battle of Bull Run was the first battle in the American Civil War. What was the first battle in the American Civil War? The Battle of Bull Run. What about the Battle of Bull Run? It was the first American battle in the Civil War. Those callbacks are really, really powerful to students that are battling with sentence structure and also comprehension. This is from the International Dyslexia Association, and it says basically what students need to do, what their responsibility of this whole process is they need to actively read and monitor their comprehension. And then take a look at all of the things that teachers need to do in order to aid a student in being a successful reader. It's a lot. So we can't just do this in one little chunk of our day, right? We, for so long, have given our class schedules, and especially in middle school and high school, where we are then just the English teacher or just the science teacher or just the math teacher, we've compartmentalized so much that only one little section of the day is getting this attention when it comes to literacy. And the truth of the matter is that we have to be master weavers. We have to weave all 5 components in all day long. And this is no excuse if you are in middle school or high school, that ideally every person in your building should be trained to understand the 5 components of reading and to know who in their classroom has dyslexic tendencies or dyslexia and has comprehension deficits. And we need to make sure that we're utilizing the whole day and the whole army of support. And if we just leave it up to just the English teacher, and that period is 45 minutes a day, it is not enough for students to catch up and become proficient. And if you are a 4th or 5th grade teacher and you have your students all day and you're only tuning into these ideas during your morning literacy block, then those students are not going to be anywhere near as proficient as they could be. If you are talking about this all day long in your read alouds and in your history lessons and in your science lessons and even in your math lessons, your students will start thinking about literacy and thinking about reading and writing in a completely different way. This is where the magic happens. I am going to model for you a story where I model all of these comprehension strategies. And in this story, it is an incredible story. I would do this as a character lesson. I would do this as a historical lesson. I would absolutely do this in secondary. But I model all of these strategies, and this lesson was designed for 3rd grade. So if you are a senior or you're teaching seniors, if you're a high school teacher, you might watch this lesson and be like, well, I couldn't really actually speak to my high school kids that way. It would feel babyish. But thinking about, we're not necessarily doing how I speak about or read this story, or even this story itself. I want you to just watch how I weave in multiple things that we've talked about from all 5 components. So I talk about the vocabulary in this text. I talk about decoding words in this text. I talk about sentence structure in this text. The one comprehension strategy that I model in this story that we didn't talk a lot about was comprehension salad. And this is in that comprehension connection book. And the reason I didn't put it in as a whole lesson here is oftentimes we want to make sure that we're being age appropriate, right? Maturity appropriate. And so for secondary students, it might be embarrassing to have a bowl and you're actually making salad, right? You're adding a little lettuce and then a tomato and then adding a little lettuce and then the cucumbers. But what that idea gives us is that while we're reading, we read a little bit and then we stop and we're thinking about it. We're processing, we're asking questions. And then we read a little more and we're thinking about it. And students that don't naturally do that, it's a very tangible way that you could explain it. So I'll put that in the comprehension vault. Feel free to modify and change that to make that age appropriate for the students that you use. But the idea behind it is that they're monitoring their own comprehension, and it gives them a tangible way to think about that. Okay, so pause the video. You can watch Malala's Magic Pencil and then rejoin. Welcome back. Isn't that an amazing story? So in this text, thinking about what we could teach by just using this picture book, and we could build connection to Alfred Nobel, so to previous higher level learning. We could do an entire Nobel Peace Prize unit. We could talk about how this is a story that was fiction, but based on a real person's life, right? So we could talk about the genre of that and how sometimes fiction and nonfiction merge. We could talk about where in the world this took place and the time period. You could bring it up even to modern day. Where is Malala now, and where is her fight for peace and equality and women's rights? So there are so many launching pads that you can do with a picture book. book. And in fact, I have an entire tub of Nobel Peace Laureates, people that have won the Nobel Peace Prize. And just reading Alfred Nobel and Malala launches into all of these other people that you could learn about, and really powerful reading. So students could learn about all different kinds of people in all different eras of time that have won the Nobel Peace Prize, and what their character traits are that allowed them to be honored in such a way. So the possibilities are endless, and I think really tuning into whatever your content is, finding picture books that could bridge for students that are intimidated by huge text or textbooks or big novels. How could you bridge for them? How could you pique their interest and give them an entry point into wanting to learn more about that concept? So we also know that summarizing is one of the top 7, right? If a student can summarize what they've read, we can gauge if they've comprehended it. And it's also a great comprehension check-in for them. So one strategy that I love for summarizing, and this can be a quick exit ticket, this could be a verbal and not even a written exit ticket, this could be a turn to your partner or someone at your table and summarize what you just read. So let's try this with Malala's Magic Pencil. If I'm just going to quickly verbalize for you a summary of that story and not tell you all the details. It's not a retell and I say and then by the time I get done you don't even have to read the book. A summary is a quick snapshot of just the highlights. So I would say Malala wanted equity and equality for all of the children and people in her community. But there were some really horrible men who came and forbid girls to go to school. So Malala ended up telling the story and writing it out and telling it to international newspapers. And then the entire world took note. And the men tried to kill Malala. Finally, she recovered and shouted from the rooftops, and the whole world knew and band together to bring peace and equality. Now, obviously, if I was writing, I would want to make sure that that wasn't run-on sentences and I would want to clean that up. But just the process of saying it out loud and then writing it and cleaning it up would be a great way for secondary student or intermediate and secondary students to get in the habit of summarizing what they read. So, one child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. Open up your binder to the comprehension pretest. Let's see how you did. Number 1, in the past, teachers frequently had students practice specific comprehension strategies and skills, such as main idea, independently. Research has confirmed that these routine, isolated, practice-oriented approaches results in lower growth for students' reading comprehension. Number 2, primary students should not be exposed to complex text with academic vocabulary because they need to work at the phoneme level with decodable text. Absolutely incorrect. Even down to kindergarten, I would say that while they do need decodable text and they need text at their own reading level, every single student should be exposed to complex text that have rich vocabulary and build background knowledge. Number 3, text-dependent questions that require inferences drawn from students' reading are more beneficial than questions that can be answered from a student's background knowledge and experience. That is true. Number 4, factors impacting comprehension are accuracy, vocab, background knowledge. D, all of the above. Number 5, wordless picture books can aid in comprehension strategies. Yes. Number 6, accuracy and fluency must come before teaching comprehension strategies. False. Number 7, which strategy has proven the most effective for increasing comprehension? It's questioning. Number 8, summarizing and retell are synonyms. False, they are not. Number 9, students need to recognize text structure and text features at all grade levels. True. And number 10, reciprocal teaching is an evidence-based way to increase comprehension and focuses on students' constant engagement with predicting, questioning, clarifying, and summarizing. And that concludes this module.